And now, a closer look at California's ballot. Since California reinstated capital punishment in 1978, nearly 900 death sentences have been handed down, but just 13 condemned inmates have been executed in that time. On Election Day, voters will decide on two dueling propositions to change the death penalty. One would abolish capital punishment, while the other is designed to speed up the process. KQED Senior Editor of Politics and Government, Scott Shafer, has more.
13 years ago, this picturesque shoreline was a crime scene connected with one of California's most notorious murders. In April of 2003, a couple walking their dog at Point Isabel Park in Richmond found the body of Modesto resident Lacey Peterson washed up on the rocks. The discovery came 4 months after she'd vanished from her home and just a day after the fetus of her unborn son was recovered less than a mile away. A few days later, her husband, Scott Peterson, was arrested and charged with murder.
We felt this was a proper case for the death penalty because of the nature of the crime, which in this case was a very premeditated, cold, calculated murder of a young woman who was pregnant.
After a trial that captured international attention, Peterson was convicted and sentenced to die. Birgit Fladager was one of the lead prosecutors on the case. She's now the district attorney for Stanislaus County.
If Prop 66 passes, it will expedite.
Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, remembers the moment her former son-in-law's death sentence was handed down.
It was very overwhelming. I mean, you're sitting there and you're listening to a judge telling him that he will be put to death. But he didn't ask Lacey if she wanted to die. He took it upon himself to do that. He definitely deserves to be put to death.
The same year Peterson began his sentence at San Quentin Prison, another inmate reached the end of his.
The 51-year-old Williams is set to die by lethal injection at San Quentin Prison at 1 minute past midnight.
The execution of Stanley Tookie Williams in December of 2005 became a cause celeb, renewing media attention and debate over the death penalty.
Those who are without sin cast the first stone. He defended.
The next year, a federal judge in San Jose stopped executions over concerns about the state's 3-drug lethal injection cocktail. Even before that, the average time between conviction and a death sentence being carried out was about 20 years. San Quentin, with more than 700 condemned inmates, now houses the largest death row in the Western Hemisphere. Continuing litigation keeps the death row inmates in a state of legal limbo.
To impose death is a huge, huge step. I'm okay that it takes a period of time so that everyone is sure, but 10 or 20 years is too long.
Like most California district attorneys, Fladager is supporting Proposition 66 on the November ballot. It would retain the death penalty and speed up executions by limiting time allowed for legal appeals. It would also require more attorneys to take death penalty cases.
I do think 5 years would be plenty to run the appellate process, especially if we have enough defense attorneys assigned to do the work that needs to be done.
11 years after he was sentenced, Scott Peterson still has no execution date. In fact, when I joined a media tour of death row late last year, I saw Peterson playing basketball with other condemned inmates. As soon as he saw journalists, Peterson stopped playing and turned his back to us.
It's hard on the victims. It's hard on everyone else to see him living his life and carrying on. That's not what his punishment was. His punishment was be put to death. And I think it wastes a lot of money when they get to live for 30 years on taxpayers' money.
Stacy Boyers was one of Lacey Peterson's best friends. 13 years after her friend's death, she's still waiting for resolution as the appeals process drags on.
I do think we're going to have an answer from the California Supreme Court within probably 2 to 3 years. And
Sharon isn't sure if she'll live to see Peterson put to death. If the date does arrive, however, she doesn't plan to attend.
It's just not something I want to observe. Knowing that it is done that's enough for me.
Many supporters of capital punishment believe a death sentence brings a sense of relief and justice. But not all crime victims' family members agree on that.
Are you guys hungry or what?
Dionne Wilson lost her husband to a violent crime more than a decade ago. In 2005, Dan Nemi, a San Leandro police officer, was answering a public disturbance call. He didn't know that one of the men he approached was on probation and would do anything to avoid going back to prison. Irving Ramirez shot Officer Nemi 7 times.
At the time, my first thought was, he just needs to die. That's it. And I wanted it to happen right then.
But after Ramirez received the death sentence, Wilson says instead of feeling a sense of relief, she actually felt worse.
I had always believed that getting a death penalty verdict would heal me. I believed all of the myths about it, that it kept communities safer, that it was a deterrent to crime, that it was cheaper than life without parole. And none of those things are true. 11 years have gone by, and now it's the last thing I want.
Over the years, Wilson has become an advocate for criminal justice reform. She's a strong supporter of Proposition 62, which would abolish the death penalty and replace it with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Like Prop 66, it also requires that inmates work and pay restitution to their victims.
Prop 62 isn't about coddling people who have murdered other people or have done horrible things. It's about how can we spend this money in a smart way? How can we prevent crime? How can we increase public safety by reinvesting these dollars?
Jeanne Woodford presided over 4 executions while she was warden at San Quentin. She feels the death penalty system is fundamentally flawed and should be ended.
It's been determined that the state of California has spent $5 billion on the death penalty and carried out 13 executions. The $5 billion is above the cost of keeping those individuals in prison for life without the possibility of parole. We could utilize that money in much more effective ways.
Another argument in favor of Prop 62 is that it would ensure the state never executes an innocent person.
We're making mistakes when it comes to the life of an innocent human being.
In September, the Yes on 62 campaign held a press conference with 17 death row exonerees from around the country.
The risk of executing somebody because of things that we might not know, like DNA, is just too high. The public often thinks, oh, well, now we have DNA. But the truth is there's DNA in just a small fraction of the cases. So you really cannot know for certain that everybody who's sitting on death row is guilty.
In 2012, voters rejected a ballot measure to ban capital punishment. Proposition 34 lost narrowly, and once again, polls show Californians divided.
What I would say to those who oppose the death penalty is, how would you feel if it was your daughter and your grandchild or any of your loved ones who was murdered?
If we do nothing, we continue to have a problem and a death penalty that doesn't work. If we abolish it, then we've just told all these crime victims' families, oh, all that work and all that grief was for nothing.
The whole system is so broken that there really is no repairing it. Let's follow much of the country and just end it.
All sides agree California's death penalty is not working. Voters will decide whether to try and fix it or scrap it altogether, or reject both ballot measures and keep the status quo.
And that was Scott Shafer reporting. I'm joined now in the studio by 2 guests, former death row inmate Shuja Graham, who was exonerated in 1981. He supports abolishing the death penalty. And San Mateo County District Attorney Steve Wagstaff, who supports expediting the process. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Shuja, wanted to begin with you. Can you please tell us about the crime you were convicted of and then acquitted? And how has that experience on death row shaped your support for Prop 62?
In 1973, November 27, I had been in prison for over 3 years at that particular time. On November 27, 1973, an uprising happened in the prison that I was in, and a human being was killed, and his name was Jerry Sanders. Myself and Jeanne Allen was indicted by the grand jury, and for the next 8 or 9 years, we had to fight for our lives. In the first trial, the jury couldn't determine our guilt or innocence. It was there in my second trial I was convicted and sentenced to die at San Quentin. After being on San Quentin's death row for a few years, the State Supreme Court of California overturned our conviction, and it was there in my fourth trial. My third trial, the jury couldn't determine my guilt or innocence, and it was there in my fourth trial I was acquitted, and I left California's death row, and I made a commitment to end capital punishment because I believe capital punishment itself doesn't help resolve or reduce crime itself. It only intensifies violence. You kill me and I kill you. I think we as a people can secure society without resorting to have to kill someone to prove the killing is wrong.
If Proposition 66, which would speed up executions, if it had been in effect back when you were in prison, do you think you would still be alive today?
Oh, it's hard to say. As you remember, I started off in 1973 in my case. After 4 trials, it took me 8 years to actually prove my innocence. I'm just one of many that have you seen throughout the years that spent many years on death row and ultimately going through the appeals process, they was proven actually innocent. And people like myself wouldn't have had a chance if Proposition 66 would have been in effect, because it would have eliminated our appeal process.
So, San Mateo County DA Steve Wagstaff, you support Prop 66, yes, keeping the death penalty but speeding up the execution process. Even if the appeals process could be reduced from an average of 25 years to 5 years, which is what Prop 66 calls for, how would that prevent innocent people like Shuja from being executed?
Well, first of all, Prop 66 does not limit it to 5 years. And I heard the district attorney there, who I know well, say that is what she would like to see. It does not do that. It simply says that we're going to cut out some of the delay period. It will not happen in 5 years, I guarantee you. Because one of our goals is absolutely that atrocities like what happened to Mr. Graham don't repeat themselves. He was convicted and sentenced under a law that no longer exists. We're under a new law now that came in 1977 in California. And we want every single right. We don't want to eliminate any right of the people who've been convicted of these crimes to exhaust every appeal they can. No elimination of appeals, because I agree, that would lead to injustice. We don't want that. What we want is to reduce the time. I'll give you the easiest example, and that is on the last case we had in San Mateo County where death was returned by a jury in 2010. It was 5 years until an attorney was available to provide defense to this person on appeal. Well, that's 5 years of absolutely nothing happening. We want to try and eliminate that by this proposition is one of the things.
How would you eliminate that, though? Prop 66 essentially requires more attorneys to accept death penalty appeals cases and then train them to handle those cases. Where would the money for that funding come from? How would you implement it?
Well, the funding, of course, does have to come from our legislature. You know, what we have found in a variety of propositions in California, 47 and many others, is when they do put in mandatory stream of money, it doesn't happen. It simply doesn't happen. It will require the legislature to follow the will of the people if they choose to pass Prop 66, to give the funding for more lawyers and to do the training. Because I don't want there to be attorneys who don't properly defend, who sleep through or are intoxicated or anything like that. That's wrong, and I know we join together in opposing that. I want properly trained ones.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, we're putting into, if it passes, we're putting into place a law where there's really no funding yet to carry it out. Does that make sense?
Almost all initiatives are in that category, where they say to be implemented, it requires funding from our legislature in order to do it. And what has been found is initiatives that do include the funding, Prop 47 is my example, doesn't happen.
Shuja, you were exonerated more than 30 years ago, and there are many cases like yours, but there are also those who are on death row who are indeed guilty. And for many victims, they've stepped forward in support of keeping the death penalty, saying that to them, capital punishment is the justice that they need. Are you denying them that justice by calling for an end to the death penalty?
No. I work with murder victim family members. My mother is a murder victim family member. Her brother was a police officer, and he was murdered. And my mother absolutely opposed the death penalty. Closure, the thing that they call closure, is a myth. I've worked with murder victim family members after the person was actually killed. They felt worse. They said, Shuja, we really don't have anyone to hurt. Just because you oppose the death penalty, you don't want someone to be executed as a consequence of killing your loved one. That don't mean you love them less. But I just think, the death penalty is a bad public policy. And I think in order to evolve as a society, we must find other ways to deal with the crime that is being committed in our society without having to execute our citizens.
So Prop 62 seeks to deal with that by resentencing condemned prisoners to life without parole. Steve, why is that not a good enough punishment?
I'll give 2 quick reasons for that. Number one, there was one of the 13 people who was executed was a man named Clarence Allen. and he orchestrated his murder while serving a life sentence. He orchestrated his murder from inside prison. So for him, what would be the greater punishment? He's already doing life. The second is that if I could have a guarantee, and of the 50 or 60 forums and debates I've done, I've always asked, will you join me in making sure that life without possibility of parole will go for the next 50 or 100 years, and you will not touch it? And I have never had one taker on that, and all the opponents, I know that's the next step, is that they will say redemptive justice and we have to eliminate life without parole. I just can't support that.
Does capital punishment, though, keep communities safer?
I think so. I think
you think so?
Oh, I very much do. I'm not saying deterrent effect. I agree very much, Mr. Graham, on that. But in terms of, for these certain crimes that are so evil, so awful, I think it does keep our communities safer. I think it will. And I attended an execution of those 13, the one from San Mateo County. I was there with the victim's family 24 years after the crime. And I agree, there are many families that get no closure. This family did.
Shuja, what do you think of what he just said?
Well, in terms of, I'm totally against capital punishment in its totality. And I'm also a person that I don't believe in punishment itself. If you violate our society, my first instinct, how do I secure society? And my next move is, how do I correct you and make you a better person? I'm not going to just cast you off because you did the worst thing. And I totally can understand how people is into a state of revenge. When I was released, I wanted revenge and everything, and I said, it wouldn't be a solution to the situation. The best thing I can do is make sure what happened to me never happened to anyone else without me raising my voice.
All right, we will leave it there. Shuja Graham, a death row exoneree, and also San Mateo County DA Steve Wagstaff, thank you both.
Okay, thank you for having me.